Australia is known for featuring some of the most dangerous animals to ever evolve on this planet. But what would you say is the most dangerous of them all? Depending on who you ask, some may say the funnel web spider, the box jellyfish, the tie-pin snake, the blue-ringed octopus, or the cone snail. If you ask me, I'd say the duck-billed platypus. I know what you're thinking. What's so dangerous about the silly-looking beaver duck? And a few years ago, I'd probably be thinking the same thing as you are. But I know from experience that platypi are no laughing matter. My older brother Derek learned that the hard way a couple years ago. I still miss Derek. I think about him constantly. Had I known what would have happened to him, I never would have let him go out that day. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In the summer of 2018, Derek took me into the woods in our backyard to go fishing in a nearby river. I was 16 and he was 18 at the time. As soon as we arrived, my brother pointed to the big rock on the riverbank. "Look," he shouted with excitement. Laying on the rock, basking in the sun, was a big brown platypus. The animal had its eyes closed and didn't seem to hear us. We had occasionally seen platypi swimming in the river from a distance, but this was the first time we had ever seen one up close. "That's odd," I said, scratching my head with bewilderment. "Don't they usually rest in burrows? I've never seen a platypus out here in the open like this." I turned to Derek and nearly dropped my fishing rod when I noticed him creeping close to the sleeping animal with one hand extended. "Derek, what are you doing?" I hissed. "I'm just gonna touch it real quick," he replied. "I want to see how its fur feels." "Don't," I said back. "We're not supposed to touch wildlife, remember?" "It's a platypus," he said calmly. "What's it going to do?" As soon as he placed his fingers on the creature's back, he let out a loud yell in pain. The platypus had jumped, startled by Derek's hand, before leaping off the rock and darted back into the water. I got a brief glimpse of a torn-like spike on one of the animal's hind legs, tipped with Derek's blood, before it dove out of sight. I turned to Derek as he groaned in pain, grabbing his bleeding wrist with his other hand as he gritted his teeth. "This is why we're not supposed to touch wildlife," I shouted at him. I know, he cried. "Just get me home quickly and help me bandage up the wound." I dragged Derek home and told our parents what had happened. We then helped him wash the wound, put disinfectant ointment on it, and wrapped it in a bandage. An hour later, I checked back on him and asked him how he was feeling. He told me that even though the bleeding stopped, his hand still hurt like crazy, and he could feel the swelling in the area the platypus stabbed him. As you can probably guess, I was starting to get concerned. I called the hospital and told them about the whole situation. The lady on the other end explained to me that the male platypus had a venomous spur on each hind leg, and that while it isn't deadly to humans, it is extremely painful, and due to how rare platypus stings are, there's been very little research done on their venom, and thus very little I could do to help my brother. No painkillers could alleviate it, unless we injected a deadly amount of morphine, and the only way to stop it completely would be to sever the nerve where the animal stung him. She went on to tell me the best thing to do would be to keep him inside, give him plenty of water, and keep an eye on his wound. I thanked her for the advice and hung up. For the next few days, Derek got worse and worse. Every night, I could hear the most horrific screams, cries, and moans I have ever heard from a human coming from his room. I would do my best to cover my ears as one or both of our parents would go to comfort him. Whenever I went to check on him in the morning, I would notice huge gashes dug into his plaster wall. Derek's fingertips would be bleeding and his nails worn down from scratching into the wall. He also had bite marks from his own teeth on his wrist, and blood all over his face from chewing on his lips and tongue. His swelling was getting worse and was beginning to leak foul-smelling pus. One night, I noticed Derek was quieter than usual. I went to his room to check on him and found it empty. I then heard a loud horse breathing sound coming from the kitchen downstairs and ran down to check. The sight before me nearly made me vomit. Derek was standing by the counter, his expression stoic and his eyes bloodshot. In one hand, he held our father's Bowie knife, which he was using to carve into his swollen wrist. He had already cut down to the bone, and a pool of blood was forming on the counter and dripping onto the floor. "Derek," I said, struggling to speak. What are you doing?" He turned to me, letting out raspy pants every second. "I can't take it anymore," he said, his voice just about a whisper. "It hurts. I have to stop it." I pulled my phone out of my pocket and called 000. An ambulance came to rush him to the emergency room. As the paramedics dragged him into the ambulance, he screamed and demanded them to let him finish amputating himself. The next day, I heard back from the hospital. While they had succeeded in fixing the damage the knife caused to Derek's wrist, he was still in horrible pain from the venom. He was continuing to scream and moan and cry, outright begging the hospital staff to kill him and permanently end his agony. Since painkillers wouldn't do any good when it came to platypus venom, the doctors briefly considered amputating his hand. However, since it had been a few days since he had been stung, the venom had probably spread to the rest of his body by now, so amputation wouldn't do any good. They decided the best thing to do was to keep him under watch and to see if his symptoms got better or worse. The staff sent me and my parents security videos of Derek in the hospital room. Each one was worse than the last one. Some of them showed Derek merely laying in bed, making horrible animalistic cries and moans. Others showed him biting or scratching himself violently. Still, others showed him running to the door and screaming for the staff to kill him. We also heard reports of Derek physically attacking hospital staff and leaving horrible bites and scratches on them. Eventually, my mother told the hospital to stop sending us the videos. We had seen enough. 1 year passed. The hospital would send us an occasional update on Derek's condition, with longer spans of time between each update. We rarely talked about Derek at home, but we thought about him constantly. We all sunk into a terrible depression and rarely ate or slept. Just last year, they told us that since there was no sign of him improving physically or mentally, they would have no choice but to euthanize him. They would allow us one more visit before they did so. Derek was barely recognizable as the same person I had known for all my childhood. He was strapped to the hospital bed to keep him from harming himself and others. His body was pale and emaciated, as if he hadn't had a proper meal in years. His fingertips had dry blood in place of nails. His face, oh God, his face. His lids were shut, having gouged out his own eyes a while back. His lips were torn, exposing his pale pink gums. His teeth had been ground down to their roots, and his tongue had been chewed off. Every single hair on his head had been pulled out, showing his pale, bloody scalp, as his vocal cords had been torn to shreds from screaming so much. He was no longer able to speak, just produce raspy breathing sounds. Even though he couldn't scream anymore, we knew he was still in horrible pain. None of us could look at him much longer. Even after his funeral, the sight of him strapped to the hospital bed still haunts my nightmares, along with those horrible screams and moans he made when he was still able to speak. However, I took one photo of Derek during our last visit. Whenever I want to warn people how dangerous platypi are and they don't believe my story, all I have to do is show them that photo of the emaciated, deformed figure in the hospital bed. That's all it takes to convince them to give platypuses a wide berth. Sure, the venom itself didn't kill Derek, but I wish it had, before he'd gotten as bad as he was. I still sometimes go by the river where that fateful incident occurred, and I sometimes see a platypus or two swimming by. Every time I see one, I immediately turn and dash back home, because all I can think about whenever I see one of those odd little critters is Derek, and the brutal lesson he taught me about messing with wildlife, no matter how harmless or silly it seems.